Welcome to The Free Will Show, a podcast that provides a beginner-friendly introduction to free will while also exploring cutting-edge developments on the topic. I'm Taylor Sear.
And I'm Matt Flummer. In this episode, we talk with Victor Tadros about issues related to the standing to blame, including whether the state has the moral authority to punish, given that it may be complicit in creating wrongdoing.
Thanks for listening. I'm happy to introduce Victor Tadros, who's professor of criminal law and legal theory at the University of Warwick. Victor is interested in a wide range of issues in moral and political philosophy, and he's published widely on criminal law in particular. He's the sole author of several books published by Oxford University Press, namely Criminal Responsibility, published in 2005, The Ends of Harm in 2011, Wrongs and Crimes in 2016, and To Do, To Die, To Reason Why from 2020. He's also the co-author of another book, co-editor of several more, and the author of many articles on topics that will be of interest to our listeners in this podcast. Today, we're going to focus on the question of moral authority or standing, and in particular on the issue of the state's moral authority to punish criminal offenders. Thanks so much for joining us, Victor. Could you start by telling us and our audience a bit about yourself, your work, and how you came to be interested in working on issues related to moral responsibility and the law?
Well, first let me say thanks for having me. It's a great pleasure to be here.
Of course, thanks for having me.
So I really started working on moral responsibility and in relation to the criminal law right at the start of my academic career. I'd finished a PhD, which wasn't on that issue, and then I started teaching criminal law. Mm-hmm. And when you teach it, immediately you ask questions about responsibilities as the criminal law is concerned with questions about intentions or recklessness, or the insanity defense. So there's a kind of standard questions which relate to responsibility. And because I was philosophically interested, it was natural to explore those questions philosophically. And in a way, that's what lawyers do too. So when you read judgments about this, there are really philosophical questions that are being raised by the courts, and then they try and give some answers to those questions. They don't always give terribly well thought out answers, but they do try and give answers to those questions which are based on philosophical considerations. And so then I started really thinking more carefully about that in the context of teaching. And because I was teaching it, I started writing about it as well. And eventually that led to my first book, Criminal Responsibility, which came out of a course which I was teaching on criminal responsibility. And in a way, each chapter was just a session that I was holding with the students, where I was thinking through the ideas that I was talking to them about. It wasn't a great book, but it was an early stab at thinking about those issues. And then really I've been interested in thinking about responsibility ever since then.
Oh, that's so cool.
Yeah, very cool. Well, you've written on a wide range of issues at the intersection of moral responsibility and the law, but one part of your work that came up in a conversation with Kyle Fritz had to do with moral authority or standing. Could you explain this idea of moral authority and give some examples of cases in which a person lacks the moral authority to blame another person?
Okay, so the first thing to sit in the background of this is just imagine a person who is in fact responsible for wrongdoing. And now let's ask a question about what we can do with respect to that person. Mm-hmm. And one question we might ask is, does a person have standing to hold that person to account for what they've done? So even if they are morally responsible, so it would be appropriate to hold them responsible for what they've done, we might nevertheless lack the authority or the standing to do so. One way of understanding that is, it might just be that I'm barred from holding them responsible, even though they really are responsible for what they've done. They might have a kind of objection to my holding them responsible, which goes like something like, look, I may have done it. I may be responsible for it, but it's none of your business. You're not the person who should be holding me to account for it. Mm-hmm. So one way to kind of exemplify that is imagine that you've got some wrongdoing within a relationship. Maybe I haven't done the dishes on time, and my neighbor comes round and says, how dare you not do the dishes? And I'm like, well, look, I may not have done them, and that might be bad, and perhaps my partner can criticize me for that, but it's really none of your business to hold me to account for not doing the dishes. So that's the kind of basic idea that you need standing in order to hold someone to account for what they've done. Mm-hmm. And then the question is, what considerations make us lack standing? And that's where a lot of the action is. I mean, some people deny there really is a question about standing at all. But if you do accept that there's something about standing, then we want to know more about what it is that undermines standing. And that's where a lot of the difficult questions arise.
Yeah, that makes sense. In the literature on moral authority and the standing to blame, it's common for philosophers to talk about hypocrisy as undermining a person's standing to blame. That's sort of a different kind of consideration than the none of your business sort of consideration you mentioned already. So if I myself have done the very thing that I'm about to blame you for, and maybe we could add, I don't have any remorse, I show no desire for repentance. It seems like I'd be a hypocrite to blame you, and so I don't really have the authority to blame in that case. In addition to hypocrisy, though, and maybe this idea of it, being some of my business, it may also be the person's complicity in bringing about something kind of undermines their standing to blame others for their involvement in it. Could you explain what you take complicity to be in this context, and give some examples of complicity undermining moral authority?
Okay, so let's just start with a really central case where two of us go and commit a crime together. So we go and rob someone's house, let's say, you and I, we go and take their stuff and run out, and then I say, how dare you do something so terrible? Right. Okay, so the fact that I was involved as well, I mean, this isn't just hypocrisy. It's not like I robbed someone else's house and then I'm blaming you. We're doing the thing together. Mm-hmm. So we're helping each other to do this thing. And then it's really odd for me then to blame you for doing this terrible thing. Now, it may not be odd, of course, if I then go and blame myself at the same time. So if I said something like, look, this was a terrible thing we did. You shouldn't have done it, and neither should I. Now, that seems like it might be appropriate. But if I don't do that and I say, look, you're a terrible person, I don't say anything about my own conduct. I say, you're a terrible person for committing this robbery. What an awful thing to do. That seems like a really strong case, I think, where there's a lack of standing, where I might regain my standing by self-criticizing. But if I don't do that, there's something deeply inappropriate about my criticizing you for doing something which I've gone along with. Now then, there's a question about what complicity amounts to, and we could think about this in broader or narrower terms. Now, the law has a whole set of accounts about what complicity involves, but I tend to think that when it comes to the moral question of when complicity undermines standing, that could be relatively broad. We might think about standing being undermined to different degrees, where if I'm the central orchestrator of the thing, that's kind of the strongest case. So imagine that I'm like a gangland boss who orders a hitman to kill someone, and then I say to the hitman, that was terrible that you killed that person. Right. I was the person who organized it. I mean, that seems like the worst kind of case where I'm like really the central organizer. The other person's just the pawn in my activity. Mm-hmm. And then we can move away from that and move to cases where I'm helping, or I encourage someone to do something, or I provide supporting equipment, and maybe I provide the person with the gun to do the hit, or I pay someone some money to do it, or there's other things which kind of like are weaker cases than the gangland boss case. And we could also imagine cases where I help someone in a way that isn't really intentional. So perhaps I'm just reckless or negligent with respect to my helping the person. So, for example, I don't lock the door and then I criticize someone for robbing someone's house when I haven't locked their door. So I've kind of done something which is helpful, but I haven't actually encouraged the robbery. Now, you might think that's a relatively weak kind of case of complicity. Right. So we can think about a whole spectrum of cases here, from the kind of like cases where standing's undermined most profoundly, the central cases, to ones where maybe standing isn't really undermined much at all because my involvement is just much, much weaker.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
So turning now to the law and to criminal punishment in particular, you've argued that even if punishment is deserved, it may be that the state lacks moral authority to dole out that punishment. Could you explain how you argue that the state is complicit in various crimes that it also punishes?
So certain things that the state does are criminogenic. By that I mean they generate crime. And an example is socioeconomic inequality, at least according to a lot of the literature. Now, all of these cases are going to be disputed, but for a lot of people, they think, look, if there are high levels of socioeconomic inequality, you're going to have a lot more criminal offending. It's the very inequality itself, rather than just poverty, it seems, that generates criminal activity. So you get a lot more crime in countries where there are large disparities of wealth and social standing.
Mm-hmm.
So then the question is, if the state then creates a society where it leaves some people really badly off and other people much better off, knowing that this is going to generate crime, and then it starts to punish people for the crime that's generated by creating this social inequality, you might think, in a sense, the state is then complicit in that kind of crime. It's created the conditions under which the criminal offending occurs. Now, a really extreme view about that is that once you generate the social inequality and you can predict that crime's going to happen as a result, that the people who commit those crimes are not responsible. But I doubt that that's often true. I think that even when you create this social inequality, you can still get responsibility for wrongdoing amongst people who are worse off in that society. But there's a further question that then arises, which draws on the thought earlier. Even if it's true that people who commit crimes under those circumstances are responsible, you might then think, look, the state is involved in generating the criminal activity. It's not as if it doesn't know that criminal activity is going to arise as a result. Governments that create this socio-economic inequality have all the literature at their fingertips that this is going to create crime. So then when they start blaming people, why can't those people say, look, you've created the conditions under which these crimes are going to occur. You're responsible for your involvement in these kinds of crimes, and now you lack standing to hold us to account for those crimes because of your very involvement. We may be responsible, but you shouldn't be holding us responsible for that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Seems like there's an analogy between like a parent and a child. Like we know that if abused children grow up to be abusers more likely than not. And so it would be like a case of a parent abusing a child, and then that child grows up to be an abuser, and then that parent blames the child for being an abuser later in life.
That's right. It's a similar kind of case. And again, we might think, look, the child that grows up into the adult and becomes an abuser is still responsible for being an abuser. The fact that something's caused them to become an abuser isn't sufficient to undermine their responsibility. But the person that's created those conditions isn't the person to do the blaming in this kind of case. So that's a kind of objection that someone might have to being held to account by the state. Mm-hmm. So look, it may be true that someone can blame me for what I've done, but the criminal justice system's a blaming system, and it blames people in the name of the state. And then when the state has generated the activity itself, it's a kind of complicit party in an offence which it's then blaming people for, and that looks, on the surface of it, problematic. Now, I should say that my view isn't that the state should then always refrain from punishing people under those conditions. Mm-hmm. So you've got to balance that consideration against other considerations, including this one, that when the state generates these socioeconomic inequalities, it also leaves people more vulnerable to crime, including people who are worse off, and it's responsible for that too. And that might generate special duties on the state to prevent crime. And punishing people is one way of preventing crime. And so one way of understanding this is that the state's got a kind of dilemma here. Once it's acted in a way that's generated this crime, you've got people who are really badly off in that society. Some of them are going to be criminal wrongdoers, but some of them are going to be vulnerable to criminal wrongdoing. And that's often the worst off people in a society too. So now it has to do something bad either way. Either it's going to blame people where it's complicit for their wrongdoing, or it's going to fail to hold them to account, not punish people, and then leave people who are badly off in that society more vulnerable to crime. So that's the dilemma that the state generates for itself by creating these socioeconomic inequalities. Mm-hmm. And sometimes it should punish people in order to protect people from crime, even though doing so is a kind of wrong against the people that it's punishing, because not to do so would commit a further wrong against those people who are vulnerable for crime. So it's not as if when you undermine standing to punish in this way, it's always decisive. There may be other considerations on the other side, which mean you should still go ahead and do the punishing. But there's something morally tainted about the punishing in these cases. Mm-hmm. And ideally, the state should then acknowledge its role in generating the crime and then change its behavior and not do it anymore. Now, of course, we know that in Western societies which have high levels of socioeconomic inequality, such as the US and the UK, that's never going to happen. The justice is never going to say, look, it was the state's fault too. Mm-hmm. So they're never really going to do that, but that's ideally what they should do.
Yeah. I was going to ask a follow-up question about that too, because you mentioned earlier introducing the interpersonal case that if we were both involved in a theft together, but then, I blame myself when I was also blaming you. If I came around to see that we were doing a bad thing, that might make a difference. I wondered what you thought that might look like in the case of the state. Would it just be a public acknowledgement of the sort of dilemma that you're talking about, or would there have to be some kind of promise to change or something? I know that might not be realistic. You might think that's not going to happen, but I wonder what you think that would look like.
That's right. So I think the state could regain standing to punish and reduce its dilemma, or maybe even eliminate it completely, if it, whilst punishing people, acknowledged its own role, recognized that that requires a response to the people that it's wronged by generating these kinds of inequalities, and then changed its policies to reduce those inequalities in the future. So then ultimately there is something that the state can do, which is kind of morally pure, even after it's acted wrongly in creating the socioeconomic inequalities in the first place. But obviously that's not going to happen. Right. So in reality, the state is creating this problematic situation which it's not actually going to address, but there is something that could be addressed. Now, just apologizing and acknowledge isn't going to be enough here. You really have to get a commitment to change the behavior and some action which is in the light of that commitment, and that seems unlikely to occur in current societies. People don't vote for it.
Right, that makes sense. I'm sure not everyone agrees that the state lacks the standing to punish criminal offenders in particular. What do you think are one or two of the best objections to this kind of approach that focuses on state's complicity? And how do you respond to those sorts of objections?
Well, some people deny that there's such a thing as standing altogether. I mentioned this at the outset. So some people just say, look, this really isn't a thing. Given that people are responsible for what they've done, and given that it's a good thing that people get blamed when they're morally responsible, there isn't really a reason to refrain from doing that when all of the kind of substantive conditions for responsibility are fulfilled. It just adds insult to injury, you might think, not to do the blaming. So that's one kind of response here, that if the state doesn't do the blaming, not only has it encouraged the criminal activity, it's also refrained from blaming the person for doing it in the name of the victim, for example. Right. And that's really problematic. So that's one kind of line of argument which you might be concerned about. Now, I think that standing cases are actually extremely powerful. So I think in the case where I'm involved in a bank robbery with another person and I blame that person, it just looks absurd for me to do it. And it's absurd partly because I haven't acknowledged my own conduct that was involved in their conduct in committing the wrongdoing. So I think what's going wrong here is that I'm not putting on the table my own wrongdoing for scrutiny. I'm just blaming the other person without holding myself to account at the same time. I had a doctoral student called Kartik Upadhyaya who wrote a brilliant thesis on that issue, which was about this kind of idea that when we hold people to account, we shouldn't just be thinking about what they're doing, we should be thinking about what we're doing. And we should be thinking about the relationship between those things. And it's not putting your own conduct on the table that's really part of the issue here. Right. He has a very nice paper coming out in the journal Utilitas, which is on that topic. Mm-hmm. So the idea here is that when people say, look, there really isn't such a thing as standing because it's just appropriate to hold people to account for wrongdoing. The answer is, yeah, that's true, but why not just make things better by holding yourself to account at the same time for the similar kind of thing that you've done or for the thing that you've been complicit in for your own conduct? That makes the overall picture better. So why not then do that as well? That's the kind of idea of standing that I kind of now think is attractive.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, interesting. Well, we focused on moral authority and punishment, but as we've said, you work on several issues at the intersection of responsibility and the law. Are there any projects you've finished up recently or still in progress that you'd like to preview for us?
Okay, so I've worked a lot on responsibility and punishment, criminal wrongs, and so on throughout my career. The thing that I'm mainly focused on at the moment is I'm writing a book on consent to sex. It's called Consent and the Sexual Revolution. Now, that may not seem like a project which is about responsibility, and it isn't in a way, but in another way, it's closely related to my work on responsibility, because the questions that you raise about whether a person can validly consent to sex are actually very similar to the questions about what makes people responsible for conduct. So think about ways in which responsibility could be undermined, such as coercion or deception or a lack of capacity. Those are the very things that can also undermine the validity of consent. We might think responsibility is important because it's closely connected with personal autonomy. And again, consent to sex and its validity seems to depend on personal autonomy. So there's actually a close relationship between my thinking about responsibility and my thinking about the validity of consent. So that's the project which I'm mainly working on. And I also have some papers which are more directly about responsibility. One of them, which I've completed recently, which is not published yet, is about the idea of avoidability. So the idea of that project is there's one question about responsibility, which is what makes our conduct attributable to us? What makes it ours? And many people think that conduct can still be ours in deterministic worlds. So suppose that the world's deterministic, so it's just inevitable what happens in the world, including all of my conduct. Let's say that that's inevitable due to the state of the world at a time before I was born. So that looks like it's a challenge to responsibility, that my conduct is inevitable. But many people think, nevertheless, I can be responsible in a sense, because my conduct can still be attributable to me in that world. It can still be mine in the sense that it can be produced out of my mental state or what I value or desire or prefer. As long as there's the right kind of causal connection between me and my conduct, the conduct is still mine. And so there's a sense of responsibility that you might think still holds in a deterministic world. And I'm very attracted to that idea. It's a kind of compatibilist idea about responsibility. Mm-hmm. But now think about a further question, which is, can it be fair in a deterministic world to impose sanctions on people? Now, the mere fact that the conduct is mine, you might think, is not sufficient to make that fair. Something else has to be true, something like the idea that the sanctions were avoidable, or that the moral basis of those sanctions could be avoidable. So my conduct was avoidable, the conduct which led to the sanctions. So many people think there's a further condition that needs to be met for sanctions to be fairly meted out, some kind of avoidability condition. And in this paper, I try and examine whether there really is such a condition for the fairness of sanctions, and then to work out whether that condition can be satisfied in deterministic worlds. And I tend to think that very carefully spelled out there is such a condition, and that actually it's very difficult to satisfy it in deterministic worlds. I don't think it's always enough to make it unfair to impose sanctions on people, but I do think that it makes the infliction of sanctions on people harder to justify, and we should do it in fewer cases than we otherwise might, and the degree of sanctions we can impose on people are less than we might intuitively think, because it's inevitable that people do the conduct they do, and so they can't avoid the conduct which leads to those sanctions. So that's a kind of middle ground paper about responsibility. It kind of accepts the idea that we can be responsible for our conduct in deterministic worlds, but some of the things that are supposed to follow from responsibility, most importantly sanctions, look harder to justify in deterministic worlds, even if we are responsible in a sense for what we do.
Yeah. That's fascinating. If I can ask one follow-up about that, we've been talking a lot about theories of punishment, justification for punishment in particular. And in earlier seasons of the podcast, we've talked with compatibilists, but also even with free will skeptics about their views of responsibility. And then sometimes it'll come up kind of practical implications for how we think of legal sanctions. Does your view make you kind of lean towards one theory of punishment that you might not have gone for were it not for your view about, the difficulty of satisfying that condition in deterministic universes? I'm just curious about your theory of the justification of punishment, how it relates to this project.
I mean, in a way, it's come to me the other way around.
Oh, okay.
I defended a theory of punishment. And then it turns out, I think, that theory of punishment is easier to vindicate in deterministic worlds than some alternatives. So my theory of punishment is called the duty view of punishment, and it goes a bit like this. When people act wrongly, they incur duties as a result of their wrongdoing. So their wrongdoing makes a difference as such to what they're required to do afterwards. The most obvious duty we have is the duty to compensate people. But in my book about punishment, I argue that they might have a wider range of duties than that, including the duties to protect other people from crime. And I suggest that because they have those duties, the state is then permitted to inflict costs on those people in order to pursue its ends, insofar as those people have a duty to serve those ends. So suppose I've committed a crime such as assault. I might now get a duty to protect other people from assaults. And because I have that duty, the state can impose costs on me in order to prevent assaults. And that's how we get a justification for deterrence in the criminal law, in the view that I have. Now, that view is a view that's in contrast with perhaps the most popular theory of punishment, which is the retributivist view. The retributivist view says we should punish people just because they deserve it. I say that duties are much more important than desert in the justification of punishment. Okay, now let's move back to the free will question. Two questions then. One, can people deserve things in deterministic worlds? In particular, can they deserve sanctions? Now, we might think, because of the arguments I offered earlier, that there are some challenges to justifying sanctions on a desert basis in a deterministic world. So we might think there are avoidability conditions that you have to put in for desert. I'm a desert skeptic more generally, so I have real doubts about desert across the board, but that's one kind of objection to desert, that in deterministic worlds we can't deserve sanctions. And many people who are kind of on the free will skeptic side, such as Dirk Perrebohm, for example, are skeptics about desert. That's really mainly what they're interested in, actually. Right. Now let's ask a second question. Could we acquire duties as a result of our wrongdoing in deterministic worlds? So suppose that it's inevitable what I do. Can I acquire duties to help other people, to protect them from wrongdoing when I'm a wrongdoer in a deterministic world? Would the fact that it was deterministic mean that I didn't have any such duties? Or could I still get duties even in deterministic worlds? Now, I tend to think that once we really think through the determinism problem, although we might think those duties are weakened, I don't think that they're undermined completely. One way to see this is to think about duties that we can get just by chance. So lots of the duties that we have can come about even when we haven't really done anything wrong. Just by harming people, we can get duties. So suppose you accidentally run someone over. You weren't really you hadn't done anything wrong. They just ran in front of your car without you seeing them. You could still get some duties towards them, I think, even if you didn't have any control over doing that whatsoever. Now imagine you've done it intentionally, but the world's deterministic. What would those duties look like? I think they would still look stronger. So now if the basis of punishment are the duties that we acquire, and we can acquire duties in deterministic worlds, I think we can also punish people in deterministic worlds, even though the amount of punishment we can inflict is somewhat less. Right. So although I think there's this avoidability condition, which I think makes a difference to punishment, I don't think that punishment systems are completely undermined in deterministic worlds on the theory of punishment that I have. For desert people, I think the challenge is much bigger, actually. Yeah. To show that there's really a compatibilist kind of story to tell there that's attractive.
Well, cool. Well, thanks for previewing that for us and for answering our follow-up questions on it. And thanks for joining us in general. We want to end by asking where listeners can go to follow what you're working on.
Okay, so I have a website which I'm not very good at keeping up to date. It has a list of my publications. If you type my name in, it's on WordPress. And so that gives you at least a reasonably recent list of the things that I've worked on. And there's also, I try and put on the papers that I'm working on at the moment in case anyone wants to read them. If anyone wants to drop me an email to find out more about my work, then they're welcome to do that. If you wanted a very kind of quick view of kind of account of my view of punishment and some questions about it, there's a discussion of it on Philosophy Bites, which is a kind of well-known competitor podcast to this one. There's a book of Philosophy Bites which has a kind of interview with me on it as well, which kind of gives a kind of basic introduction to my views, which might also be helpful to people.
That's great. Yeah.
very
We'll link
cool.
both those things, your website and that interview on Philosophy Bites, in the show notes.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks, Victor.
But thank
Our next episode will focus on rehabilitation, and our guest will be Katrina Seifert, professor of philosophy at Elmhurst University.
you very much for having me.